Imagine this. It is 3 in the morning. The room is dark, and someone you love has just collapsed on the floor in front of you, not breathing, not moving, and your entire body goes cold with panic. Your hands are shaking, your mind goes completely blank, and the only thing standing between that person and death is a 3-digit number you have dialed your whole life without ever once asking yourself, why these 3 digits? Why not 4? Why not 2? Why not simply the word help? And who in the history of this country sat down one day and decided that 911 would be the sound of salvation? Because today, in this video, we are going to answer that question completely, slowly, deeply, and with full respect for how extraordinary and how accidental this story truly is. To understand why 911 exists, you first have to understand what America looked like before 911 existed, because this is the part that most people never think about. Before 1968, there was no single emergency number anywhere in the United States. Not one, not anywhere. And if your house was on fire, or if someone was stabbing you in an alley, or if your father had a heart attack at the dinner table, you had to know the specific local 7-digit phone number of your specific local police department or your specific local fire station. And if you were in a city you had never visited, or if you were a child who had never memorized those numbers, or if it was the middle of the night and your mind was too overwhelmed with fear to think clearly, you were simply out of luck, because the phone book was not going to save your life in 45 seconds. And people died because of this. Real people, documented people, mothers and fathers and children who could not get help fast enough, not because help did not exist, but because the system for reaching that help was broken, scattered, disorganized, and invisible to anyone who needed it most urgently. And it was against this deeply human failure that the story of 911 begins. The year is 1967, and President Lyndon B. Johnson has formed a commission, the President's Commission on Law Enforcement and Administration of Justice. And this commission releases a landmark report, and buried inside that report is a quiet but revolutionary recommendation. A recommendation that the United States create one single, universal, easy-to-remember emergency telephone number, one number for every American in every city in every state. And the thinking behind this was profound in its simplicity. When a person is in danger, their brain does not function at full capacity. Fear narrows the mind, adrenaline floods the body, rational thought becomes difficult. And so the system designed to save lives must be as simple as humanly possible. It must require almost no cognitive effort. It must be something a 5-year-old child or a 90-year-old grandmother could recall instantly under the worst pressure of their lives. And so the question became, what is that number? And here is where the story becomes genuinely fascinating, because the answer was not chosen by a committee of philosophers or neuroscientists. It was chosen largely through a collaboration between the American government and AT&T, which at the time was the dominant telephone company in the country, practically a monopoly that controlled the infrastructure of nearly every telephone line in America. And AT&T had a very specific technical constraint that shaped everything. In 1968, the rotary phone was still the primary technology most Americans used. And on a rotary phone, the time it takes to dial a number is determined by how far the dial has to spin, meaning the number 9 takes longer to dial than the number 1. And so from a pure engineering standpoint, the ideal emergency number needed to be short, it needed to be something that had never been used as a local area code or an office code anywhere in the existing telephone system, so that it could be routed uniquely and immediately, and it needed to be simple enough that a person could dial it in the dark, in a panic, with trembling fingers. And when AT&T engineers and government officials examined the full landscape of possible numbers, 911 emerged as the answer that satisfied every single constraint simultaneously. It was just 3 digits, which meant it was faster to dial than any 7-digit local number. It began with 9, which was a distinctive spin on the rotary that made it feel deliberate and not accidental. It ended with 2 ones, which on a rotary required almost no effort. And most critically, 911 had never been assigned as a local area code or office code anywhere in North America, which meant that the telephone network could be programmed to recognize it as a special signal and route it directly to emergency services without any of the confusion that would come from using a number that already meant something else, somewhere. And so, on February 16, 1968, in Haleyville, Alabama, a small town that most Americans have never heard of and probably could not find on a map, the very first 911 call in American history was made. And the person who received that call was a congressman named Tom Beeville, and the person who made it was the Alabama Speaker of the House. And the phone used to make it was a bright red phone, symbolic in every possible way. And the moment that call connected, a new era in American emergency response had officially begun. But here is what most people do not realize. That moment in Haleyville was not the end of the story. It was barely the beginning. Because even after that first call in Alabama, 911 did not immediately spread across the country the way you might expect. In fact, it took decades, literal decades, for 911 to reach every corner of America, because each city and each county had to build its own dispatch infrastructure, had to train operators, had to wire up the routing systems, had to pay for the equipment. And there were places in rural America that did not have full 911 service until the 1990s, which means that for nearly 30 years after that first call in Alabama, there were still Americans who, in a moment of crisis, had to search for a local number. Still Americans whose lives were put at risk not by the absence of emergency services, but by the absence of a simple, unified system to reach them. And this tells us something important about how progress actually works in the real world, not in one dramatic leap, but in a slow, uneven, grinding march forward. And then, just as the physical infrastructure of 911 was finally reaching maturity, a new revolution arrived that threatened to break the system all over again. And that revolution was the mobile phone. Because 911 was built for landlines. It was built for phones that were physically attached to a wall in a house with a known address. And when you call from a landline, the dispatcher could see exactly where you were. Your address appeared on their screen automatically. But when the mobile phone arrived and millions of Americans began making calls from inside cars and forests and highways and shopping malls, the location technology did not exist to tell the dispatcher where that person was. And so in the 1990s and early 2000s, you could call 911 from your cell phone in genuine danger, and the dispatcher might have absolutely no idea which city you were in, let alone which street. And this gap was so dangerous, so obviously life-threatening, that the Federal Communications Commission stepped in and mandated that wireless carriers build what is called Enhanced 911, or E911. A system that uses GPS and cell tower triangulation to automatically transmit the approximate location of a mobile caller to emergency dispatchers. A system that today can pinpoint your location within a matter of meters in most urban environments. And yet, even this was not the final chapter, because technology never stops moving, and today, 911 is being reimagined once again for a world where people send texts instead of making calls, where people who are deaf or mute or hiding in silence from an intruder cannot speak out loud, where people communicate through video and images and location pins. And so many American cities have now implemented what is called Text to 911, a system that allows you to send a text message to emergency services if calling is not possible. A system that represents the same underlying philosophy that created 911 in the first place, the belief that help must be reachable by anyone, in any condition, under any circumstance, with as little friction as possible. And so when you go back to that image we began with, the dark room, the person on the floor, you're shaking hands, and you pick up your phone and you press 9, then 1, then 1. What you are doing in that moment is participating in more than 50 years of human effort, engineering, political will, heartbreak, failure, revision, and relentless improvement. You are touching a number that was born from the deaths of people who could not get help fast enough, refined through the voices of engineers who believed that simplicity could save lives, expanded through the anger of advocates who refused to accept that rural Americans deserved less protection than city Americans, and rebuilt again and again to survive the arrival of new technologies that no one in 1968 could have imagined. And perhaps the most profound thing about 911 is not the number itself, but what the number represents, which is a society's decision to say that when one of its members is in the worst moment of their life, that moment will not be made worse by confusion or complexity, that the bridge between a person and the help they need will be as short and as clear and as reliable as 3 digits dialed in the dark. And the next time you hear those 3 numbers, whether in a news broadcast or a movie, or in a moment of genuine emergency, I want you to remember that they are not just a phone number, they are a philosophy, they are a promise, and they are, in the most literal and human sense of the word, the sound of a civilization trying to take care of its people. Thank you for watching, and if this story moved you the way it moved me, share it with someone who deserves to understand the extraordinary history hiding inside the most ordinary 3 digits in America.